They left him to die. The Doberman puppy who couldn't breathe until someone finally stopped. It wasn't a bark, not even a cry. It was the sound of a creature far too small and too drained to beg for help any longer. That night, the wind from the Blue Ridge Mountains slipped through the crack of my truck window, carrying that faint, ragged whimper, thin hoarse, and broken like a rusted wire tightening around a throat. I slammed the brake's gravel, scattering under the tires in a harsh rattle. For a few seconds there was nothing but the dying hum of the engine and that fragile sound echoing up from the ditch beside the road. My name is Evan Walker 47. I used to be a firefighter 20 years in Asheville, North Carolina. 3 years ago, my wife died of cancer, and since then I've lived alone in a small wooden house deep in the forest volunteering at the Blue Ridge Animal Haven. I thought I'd grown used to death, to those final, stuttering breaths fading in my hands. But the sound that night was different. It made my heart seize. I grabbed my flashlight, climbed down the muddy slope, and followed the faint whine into a pile of plastic trash behind the farmer's market. The beam swept across shards of glass, catching the pale moonlight, each one glinting like bits of bone in the grass. And then I saw it. A Doberman puppy barely a month or two old, small enough to fit in both my hands. Its body was all ribs and trembling skin, the black and tan fur caked with dirt. Around its neck was a white plastic ring, maybe the cap of a large milk jug drawn so tight the flesh beneath was sunken raw and bleeding. Every breath was a battle. Each rasp tore through the night as if even the air refused to enter its lungs. I froze, not from fear, from disbelief that anyone could walk past this and not stop. This wasn't neglect. This was cruelty, wrapped in silence. A tiny being strangled slowly under daylight, and no one thought it mattered. It lifted its head and looked at me. No bark, no whine, just a stare. Those eyes, cloudy, wet, desperate, asked one question. Will it hurt much longer? I knelt, my voice hoarse. Easy there, kid. It's okay. The words felt hollow in the cold wind, a promise even I wasn't sure I could keep. I reached out. It flinched, shrinking back, the plastic ring scraping its raw skin with a dry hiss that made me shiver. The smell of burned plastic and blood filled the air, the scent of pain, of human indifference. Then instinct took over. No thinking, only movement. I pulled off my denim jacket, slid it beneath the pup, and lifted him slowly. He was light as ash, yet in my arms he felt as heavy as the whole damned world. He didn't struggle, didn't cry, just breathed in short, shallow bursts, each weaker than the last, as if too tired to fight anymore. I could feel that tiny heart racing wild beneath the jacket, the last proof of life. "Don't quit on me, buddy," I whispered, my throat shaking. "Don't leave me now." The flashlight swept back over the spot where he'd lain, leaving a small round dent in the dirt, a hollow no bigger than a grave. I ran toward the truck, his breath hot against my neck, fading with each step. Every stride felt like crossing the line between life and silence. I laid him on the passenger seat. The white ring around his neck glowed under the dashboard light, cold, accusing like a shackle. I leaned close into the exhaustion clouding his eyes and said softly, "Hang in there, Scout." The name came out on instinct, short, sharp, and defiant. A survivor's name. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the mountain fog, and through the wind and darkness I heard the smallest thing of all, a faint breath. But real. Scout was still alive, and I swore if I had to race the whole night itself, I would not let that breath fade away. I pressed the gas. The truck roared, cutting through the winding mountain road. Rain whispered against the windshield, and the wind hit hard, making the faint breaths beside me sound even more fragile. Scout lay on the passenger seat, his head resting on my arm. Every time we hit a bump, his tiny body shuddered uncontrollably. I gripped the wheel tight, fighting both the slick asphalt and the rising fear climbing up my throat. Up ahead, the lights of Blue Ridge Animal Haven flickered through the rain. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 11:48 p.m. The clinic had closed at 9. But tonight, I wasn't knocking. I would break the door if I had to. Scout's breathing grew uneven. Each inhale was a wet, rasping rattle. I pressed my hand to his chest. His heart still beat, but so fast it felt like it might burst. "Don't you quit on me, Scout," I whispered, voice shaking. "You still owe me one more breath." When I pulled into the parking lot, I switched the headlights to high beam and flooded the glass doors with white light. Dr. Grace Mallory had just finished her shift. She saw the truck and ran out. Before she could ask, I had already thrown the door open and rushed inside carrying Scout in both arms. Plastic ring, neck, can't breathe. The words broke out of me in fragments. Grace didn't hesitate. She signaled her team. 2 technicians sprinted over, spreading a towel on the metal table. Scout lay motionless, his breathing so faint it was barely a mist on his lips. The fluorescent lamp overhead caught the white plastic ring and turned it into a glowing halo of guilt. "Cut it," Grace ordered. The scissors slid into the narrow gap between skin and plastic. "Careful. Don't hurt him more," I murmured, my fists whitening. A soft snap echoed small yet thunderous in my head. The ring fell into the metal tray with a cold, hollow clang. The flesh beneath was swollen, raw bleeding. Grace rinsed the wound, injected antibiotics, and wrapped his neck in gauze. "Can't promise anything," she said, eyes fixed on Scout. "But he's got a chance." I stood frozen, watching that fragile chest rise and fall short, shallow, thread-thin. Then suddenly, Scout gasped a harsh wheeze, tearing from his throat, shaking his whole body. The sound ricocheted through the quiet room. "He's still fighting," Grace whispered. "Good," I managed to say, "because so am I." When the wound was dressed, a technician inserted a tiny IV line and clipped a heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Steady, faint, alive. I hadn't realized I was crying until a tear hit my hand. Not from pity, from relief. Because in that sterile white room, a life had just chosen to stay. I sank into a chair beside the table, my jacket soaked in blood and mud. Grace exhaled softly. "You always bring miracles late, Evan." I gave a tired smile. "I only bring the breath that's left." Scout lay still, head tilted, eyes closed. Every gentle rise of his chest loosened something tight inside me. There was no music, no heroism, only the slow drip of an IV and the steady rhythm of a life clawing its way back from the edge. I remembered the last person I carried out of a fire. He never opened his eyes again. But tonight, a small dog was fighting for air in my hands, and somehow that made me feel alive again. Grace peeled off her gloves and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You should rest. We'll monitor him tonight. If he makes it through 6 hours, he has a real shot." I shook my head. "No, I'm staying. I brought him here. I won't leave until he knows what safety feels like." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft amber. I slid down against the wall beside the table. Scout lay wrapped in a small blanket, the IV glimmering faintly in the warm glow. I listened to each breath, still weak, but steadying, slow and sure. Outside, the wind sighed through the pine ridge, carrying the mountain chill. But inside that tiny room, the warmth from one fragile body spread outward, lighting every dark corner left inside me. Dawn was breaking when I was still in that small room. The rain had stopped, leaving only the wind whispering through the cracks in the door. The soft, amber light reflected off the steel counter, falling across the tiny body lying motionless on a thin blanket. Scout was still alive. His breathing was shallow but steady, and every time his chest lifted, I felt something ease inside me as if I was allowed to breathe with him. Dr. Grace stepped in a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. "You haven't gone home yet?" she asked softly. I shook my head. If I leave, I'm afraid I'll miss the moment he stops breathing. Grace didn't answer. She set the cup beside me and adjusted the IV line. "You know," she said quietly, "most of the animals abandoned like this. The wounds you see aren't the worst ones. It's the wounds to their trust that take the longest to heal." I looked at Scout. He was lying on his side, his head resting on a small pillow, the white bandage around his neck stark against his muddy black and tan fur. "He made it through the night," I murmured. "That's enough for today." Grace nodded, offering a tired smile. "Actually, around here surviving one night is always a little miracle." On the second morning, Scout opened his eyes. The dim light of the lamp shimmered in his brown pupils, still cloudy. Confused, like he'd just woken into a world he didn't recognize. I leaned close and whispered, "Morning, kid." He didn't move, just looked at me, breathing softly before closing his eyes again. By noon, when I reached out to check his IV, he flinched. His breath hitched, legs twitching as if he expected pain. I froze, pulled my hand back, and sat down quietly. Silence that was the only language the frightened can bear, because silence doesn't betray. I sat like that for almost an hour. Scout opened his eyes once, watched me, then closed them again. This time, his breathing slowed. I inhaled deeply too, syncing my rhythm with his. And I realized something to teach a scared creature what safety feels like. Sometimes you have to learn how to breathe with it. That afternoon, Grace brought in a small bowl of soft food. "Try this," she said, setting it on the floor. "He hasn't eaten in 36 hours. I placed it half a meter away and backed off. Scout glanced at the bowl, then at me. His eyes still trembled, but there was something new there, a spark of curiosity fragile as smoke. He leaned forward, sniffed, and then licked once, very softly, very slow. But it was the first time he chose life over fear. I laughed and tears spilled before I knew it. Grace turned, saw us, and just smiled. No words. A quiet joy between two people who'd both seen too much loss. I thought then maybe miracles don't always sound like thunder. Sometimes they sound like a small dog daring to eat again. That second night I stayed. Scout slept peacefully, breathing even. I rested my head on the chair and drifted off. When I woke, I felt something warm, his head pressing lightly against my arm. A faint, almost accidental touch. But to me it was the first sign of trust. "It's okay now, Scout," I whispered. "You're safe." He didn't understand the words, but maybe he understood the heartbeat behind them. His small ears twitched, his body no longer stiffened. We stayed like that in a gentle silence, two broken souls learning to piece themselves back together. By morning, Grace checked the wound, her voice calm. "The skin's closing, no infection, he'll recover completely." I smiled, but inside a strange mix of gratitude and fear welled up. Gratitude that he'd lived. Fear because I knew he might be starting to need me. At the door, Grace paused. "You know, Evan," she said softly, "sometimes the weakest creatures end up teaching us how to be strong." I looked at Scout, the little dog who'd once been strangled for existing, now sleeping quietly, his muzzle twitching like he was dreaming. And I realized she was right. Maybe this tiny creature wasn't the one being rescued. Maybe he was the one rescuing me. A week later, Scout could finally stand. The white bandage still wrapped around his neck, but his steps were steadier now, the small legs no longer trembling each time they touched the ground. Every morning, I arrived early to clean the recovery area while Dr. Grace unlocked the isolation ward to move the animals who'd survived the danger phase into the shared nursery. That morning, Grace said Scout can leave the treatment room. I think he's ready for someone." I looked at her and smiled. "And you already have someone in mind, Buddy." Buddy was a golden-coated beagle, 3 years old, rescued from a litter abandoned in the southern mountains. Since the day he'd arrived at the shelter, he'd been the first to greet anyone who stepped through the door, a creature born to love and to teach others how. When Scout was brought in, I gently placed him in a small kennel facing Buddy's. Buddy lay chewing on an old tennis ball. Hearing the noise, he lifted his head, one floppy ear twitching. Their eyes met. Scout froze, took a half-step back, head lowering. Buddy watched him then. Released the ball, nudging it forward with his nose until it rolled toward Scout. The ball stopped between the two kennels. Scout stared, hesitated, then turned away. Buddy didn't mind. He just gave one short, cheerful bark, light and crisp like an invitation. A single woof that filled the quiet room with something that sounded almost like hope. I sat in a chair across from them, silent. That moment reminded me of standing outside a burning house, except this time I wasn't waiting for a cry for help, but for a sign of life. That afternoon, Scout took a step toward the ball. One step, then pause, another, then a glance toward Buddy. Buddy didn't move, just wagged his tail once, slow and patient. Finally, Scout reached out a paw and touched the ball. It rolled forward, then back again. I heard the soft tap, and in that tiny sound Scout had crossed the line between fear and curiosity. Grace entered her voice, quiet. "See that he's learning how to live again." I nodded, unable to speak. My chest tightened, not from sadness, but from something that felt dangerously close to faith. The next day, Buddy pushed the ball again. This time, Scout didn't hide. He sniffed it, tapped it gently, the little nose twitching as he breathed fast. His eyes widened, and then a sound broke free. Not loud, not strong, just a rough trembling bark, cracked, and small but real. I nearly jumped to my feet. Grace, walking by, stopped and turned. Buddy barked back, tail wagging wildly, eyes shining bright. The two dogs barked again softly together, the sound echoing through the room. It wasn't fear anymore. It was life finding its voice. My throat burned. I'd waited months to hear that sound, the sound of courage, of choosing to speak after too long in silence. Scout looked at Buddy, tongue peeking out, eyes lit for the first time since that night I carried him through the rain. That evening, I sat in the recovery wing. Both dogs lay near each other, separated only by a thin grid of steel. Buddy stretched his paws, Scout did the same. Buddy rested his head. Scout mirrored him perfectly. I couldn't help but laugh, a perfect reflection of trust. Then Scout shifted closer, pressing his back softly against the bars. I knew he wasn't hiding. He was reaching for warmth. I whispered, "Good job, Scout," just like that. His ears twitched. No eye contact needed. I knew he understood. Outside, night rolled in. A pale moonlight slipped through the window, falling over the two small bodies lying side by side, one Doberman once strangled for breathing, and one beagle once starved for being born. Two survivors now learning peace in the same rhythm of air. I leaned my head against the wall, eyes closing. The heater hummed low. Their breathing mingled warm, steady, alive. And somewhere deep inside I felt something loosen, as if the rope once knotted around my heart had finally been cut free. That morning, the sky was clearer than it had been in weeks. The sun spilled over the grass behind the shelter, a warm golden light draping the mist like a soft blanket. Dr. Grace and I opened the recovery yard to let the dogs feel the sun. Buddy raced in wide circles, tail whipping happily. Scout stood still, eyes narrowing against the light as if learning for the first time how to see the world without fear. "Let him choose," Grace said. "Don't push." I nodded and unlatched the gate. Scout hesitated for a few seconds, then stepped out, slow, deliberate, steady. The fur around his neck had begun to cover the scar, leaving only a faint silver line like a thread of light. I watched him, pride spreading quietly through my chest. A creature once strangled for breathing now stood in the sunlight on his own. I thought maybe he'd left the darkness behind, but memories have a way of finding you when you least expect them. Around noon, as we cleaned the feeding area, a technician dropped a white plastic bottle cap onto the concrete floor. Click. A dry, hollow sound, harmless to anyone else, sliced through the air and reached Scout. I saw his whole body stiffen. His eyes went wide, tail tucked back, arched. He started panting short and sharp as if an invisible cord had just tightened around his throat. Then he bolted to the far corner of the yard, curling in on himself, shaking violently. Scout, I called, but he didn't hear me. He wasn't here anymore. In his mind, that plastic ring had come back. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. "It's okay, kid. It's me," I murmured. He kept gasping claws, scraping the wall, lost in panic. Buddy stopped playing. He didn't bark, didn't run. He simply looked, then walked forward light and careful as if afraid to break the fragile silence hanging in the air. He stopped halfway, lay down, rested his head on his front paws, eyes fixed on Scout. No command, no demand, just waiting. I understood. I knelt beside Buddy, voice low and calm. "Scout, that sound can't hurt you anymore. You're safe now." No answer. Only the sound of ragged breathing and claws scratching softly against concrete. Then Buddy moved again. He crawled forward, inch by inch, until his nose touched the source of terror, the white plastic cap. He sniffed it, then nudged it gently away. Click. The sound came again, but this time it carried no threat. It was just a noise in a quiet afternoon. Scout lifted his head. His pupils were still wide, but something had changed. He looked at Buddy, at the cap, then at me. His breathing slowed. A minute passed, then another. He stretched forward, inching out of the corner, as if stepping across his own fear. I didn't move. Every step he took felt like my heart beating in my chest. When he reached Buddy, the beagle stayed perfectly still. Finally, Scout leaned forward and touched his nose to Buddy's back. No growl, no tremor, just a brief, warm, undeniable touch. I drew a long breath, holding it in, fighting the surge in my throat. Grace stood in the doorway, a hand over her mouth, eyes glistening. No words were needed. We all knew this was the moment Scout broke free of his invisible chain. That entire afternoon, the two dogs lay side by side beneath the trees. Scout rested his head on Buddy's paws, eyes half closed. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, falling across his neck, the pale scar catching the light, glimmering like a silver thread, stitching a soul back together. I sat nearby, holding a cup of cold coffee. Everything around us was still. No fear. No memory had the power to choke anymore. Only two steady breaths, two heartbeats in sync, and the soft silence of peace being born again. A month after Scout's panic attack, the shelter began to fill with more visitors. Spring had come to the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the sound of water trickling behind the building. The air felt light, as if the whole world had been rinsed clean after winter. Buddy had grown stronger, rounder still, the first to greet everyone with his warm bark. Scout was different. He no longer hid in the corner or flinched when people walked by. But in his eyes there was still something, a thin veil between trust and doubt. I knew it took more than food or warmth for a creature once betrayed to believe in people again. He needed someone who could see him. That afternoon, while I was refilling water bowls, a family walked in. The father, Tom Parker, around 40, sturdy build, calm face. The mother, Sarah, gentle standing, slightly behind. And their son, about 7, Ethan, small, messy brown hair, eyes wide as if he wanted to take in the whole room at once. Grace said softly, "The Parker family wants to adopt a dog. They lost their old Labrador 2 months ago." I nodded, saying nothing yet. Ethan walked down the row of kennels, small hand sliding along the bars. When he reached Scout's stall, he stopped. Scout sat quietly in the corner, head tilted, slightly calm gaze fixed on the boy. No bark, no retreat, just watching. Ethan crouched down and whispered so softly it sounded like he was talking to himself. "He's not scary." Those 3 words hit me like a stone to the chest. Tom started to tell his son to step back, but I raised a hand. "Let them," I said quietly. "Let them choose each other." Scout stood up, slowly, carefully. He stepped forward, paws light on the concrete like wind brushing dry leaves. The boy stayed perfectly still, palm open, not trembling, not forcing. When Scout's nose touched that small hand, Ethan smiled a pure, fragile smile that made my heart stop for a beat. Sarah covered her mouth and Grace breathed, "Oh my God." Tom knelt beside them, eyes softening. Then he turned to me. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly. So I told him. About that first night by the roadside, the white plastic ring, the choking breaths, and the slow climb back to trust. When I mentioned Buddy the Beagle, who'd taught Scout to play again, Ethan glanced toward the far kennel where Buddy lay, then smiled. "They're friends, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, and now we just want him to have one more friend." The Parkers fell silent. In the adult's eyes, I saw hesitation, the quiet math of time-space responsibility. But in the boy's eyes, there was only light. Ethan stayed crouched by Scout, whispering, "He's not scary. He just needs someone to stay." That sentence, simple, small, carried everything I'd ever tried to teach the world. No pity, just presence. The next day they came back. A thin drizzle fell over the yard, the scent of damp pine seeping through every crack in the door. Tom held a red leash. Sarah carried a folded blanket. Ethan ran ahead, soaked and smiling wide. Scout rose when he saw them. No barking, no hesitation, just a few gentle steps forward, tail wagging, eyes bright. He recognized them. I opened the kennel. Ethan knelt and wrapped his arms around Scout's neck, resting his head where the bandage had once been. "Let's go home," he whispered. Scout pressed his cheek into the boy's shoulder, eyes closing, breathing slow, as if whispering, "Yes." Grace handed the adoption file to Tom, her voice trembling. "You've chosen a very strong soul." Tom shook his head. "No, I think he chose us." I stood there speechless. Buddy watched from the corner, calm and still. When Scout turned back, Buddy lifted a paw, placing it gently against the bars. Scout stepped close and touched noses through the mesh, a brief, silent touch that said more than any goodbye ever could. The car door shut. The engine started. Scout looked out the window, head resting on Ethan's lap. The red leash glowed against the gray rain, the first trace of freedom. As the car turned down the muddy road, I stood beneath the awning, rain soaking my jacket, but warmth filling my chest. Because what I saw that morning wasn't a farewell. It was the beginning of a home. A month after Scout left the shelter, the room where he'd once fought for life felt strangely empty. I still came to Blue Ridge Animal Haven every morning, cleaned the kennels, checked the medicine log, brewed coffee in the old thermos my wife used to love. Routine keeps a man alive after loss, but it never helps him forget. Buddy still slept on the blanket in the corner, the same one Scout used to share. Some nights I'd wake to see Buddy sitting up, staring at the empty kennel, then exhaling softly, a sound so small only those who've lost something could recognize it. Grace told me I should be happy because Scout finally had a home. I nodded, but inside there was a quiet place that even joy couldn't reach. Each time I passed the far wall, my eyes drifted toward the shelf where the white plastic ring that once strangled Scout now rested. I hadn't thrown it away, not to remember the pain, but to remind myself, some things we cut loose not to forget but to turn them into light. One early morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah Parker. Just one line Scout wants to say hi. And a video file. I opened it. The image shook slightly, washed in soft daylight. A wide, yard-green grass, golden sunlight slanting low. Scout was running, ears flapping, black and tan coat shining a bright red collar around his neck. In the distance, Ethan laughed, calling out, "Scout, come here!" Scout turned, sprinted toward the boy, legs kicking up blades of grass, his breath strong, alive, full of joy. The thin scar on his neck caught the sun, no longer a mark of pain, but a badge of survival. In the final frame, Ethan hugged Scout, pressing a kiss to his head. Sarah's voice came from behind the camera, soft and trembling. "He's not afraid of plastic anymore, Mr. Evan. Yesterday, Ethan dropped a bottle cap, and he just looked at it, then walked away." I laughed, and the tears came anyway. Beside me, Buddy tilted his head, eyes gentle and calm. I stroked his fur. "See, Buddy? He's okay," Buddy answered with a quiet sneeze, as if to agree. That afternoon, a light rain fell. I walked the shelter's grounds, watching the new kennels, the animals resting inside. A three-legged cat slept in a cardboard box. A blind dog sat listening to the music coming from a tiny radio. Everything was peaceful, though each had once come from its own kind of hell. And I realized maybe what keeps them alive isn't miracles. It's kindness, the one language they still understand, even if they can't speak it. When the sun began to set, I returned to the room. The orange light poured through the window, glinting off the white plastic ring on the shelf. It shimmered softly, glowing gold, gentle and pure like Scout's breath that first night. I touched it and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up, kid." Outside, Buddy barked twice. A car pulled up at the gate. Tom and Ethan stepped in, Ethan holding a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. Inside was a photo, Scout sleeping on a porch, the words scrawled beneath it, "For the man who helped him breathe again." I stared at it, my chest tightening. Ethan looked up, beaming. "Scout told me to bring this to you. He still remembers you." I knelt, hugged him tight, voice rough. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for reminding me what I'd forgotten, that sometimes the only thing we really have to do is stay." That night, I placed the photo beside the white ring. Outside, the rain whispered against the roof, the scent of wet earth mingling with the familiar pine. Buddy curled at my feet, breathing softly. The room was the same, but it didn't feel empty anymore, because somewhere out there, Scout was running in the sunlight. Ethan was laughing, and I knew that this world, cruel as it can be, still has room for small, stubborn kindness. I looked once more at the ring. The lamplight hit it, turning it into a halo that had forgotten it was ever meant to harm, and I said quietly, my voice steady but low, "Sometimes to help a soul breathe again, all it takes is someone brave enough to stay. Some souls will never know how to say thank you, but if you listen long enough, you'll hear it in their breathing and the quiet gratitude behind their eyes when a hand reaches out instead of turning away." I used to think I rescued Scout, but the truth is, he rescued what was left of the human part of me, the part that still believes kindness survives even in a world that can be unbearably cruel. If you've made it this far, take just 1 second to share this story or follow Call of Hope Rescue. Not for me, but for the dogs still trembling somewhere out there waiting for someone to stop. Every share is a chance. Every viewer a breath given back to life. Stay with us. Stay with compassion. Because sometimes, the only thing a soul really needs is someone brave enough not to walk away.